I'd like to think the fact that we knew nothing to start with probably was an advantage. We're now seeing the strongest aluminium castings in the world. We're getting incredible results. 50% because we didn't know what we're doing and we tried something and got it to work.
How do you think about the balance between getting kicked in the balls, as you were describing it earlier, on a weekly or daily basis, and then the occasional high where you get a breakthrough?
Look, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. I think you spend most of the day getting kicked. I think if you're working on something that you believe in, then the highs are probably enough to kind of keep carrying you through.
What would the leadership advice to the 16-year-old version of yourself be, given what you know now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of advice around, do what you love and this sort of thing, and I think that's really bad advice. So I think my point of view is more that comes from people who have, really worked hard at a skill or an industry and mastered and become successful, and then they love that job or that role. So I think it's more find something you can put up with that you're good at, that not many other people want to do, and over time you'll then love that thing and be, have a really satisfying life in that.
And I remember a really good conversation with my dad where I was saying, I'm thinking about doing this thing, but, I've got maybe 2 months of money. Like if this doesn't work out, what's going to happen? And I remember Dad saying, do you know anyone that's starved to death? And I was like, no, I don't know anyone that's starved to death. And he's like, it's going to be fine. I think every founder has a certain amount of imposter syndrome, right?
Sure.
I think we all sit there going, aren't we supposed to really know more about what we're doing and be more onto it? I think what surprised me is how much I've loved
Welcome to the Startup Theatre podcast. This podcast is produced by Empire Films.
Welcome to the world's biggest startup podcast, Startup Theatre. I'm your guest co-host, Flynn Van Dam. Today on the podcast, we'll have some guests from the scientist Entrepreneurial land. Axton Pitt from LitMaps and David Moide from Foundry Lab. I'll also be interviewing my amazing co-host, Serge van Dam, with some hard-hitting questions. Firstly, Serge, why are you such an amazing podcaster?
Why am I such an amazing podcaster? What a great question you must have great genes. Well, I think it really sort of comes from just being curious and being interested, and also being a passionate advocate of people trying to build businesses and change the world. And so I think that curiosity and that passion really makes me an amazing podcaster.
Next question. What is Startup Theatre all about?
Well, everyone involved in Startup Theatre, even Troy, but definitely Adrian and Finn and Jono, we're very passionate about startups, and we wanted to do a show that was a little bit unpredictable, a little bit funnier, a little bit left or right of centre, I guess. And so we thought, we want to be a little bit theatrical, and so we use the label Startup Theatre, even though the logo is rubbish.
Next question. I know I'm a pretty drippy dude, but why do you dress so badly?
What, you little shit! Hello everybody, welcome to Startup Theatre. I'm Serge van Dam, today hosting on my own without my colleagues, so I'm free to roam. And I'm going to roam in a conversation with two founders, Axton Pitt from LitMaps, as well as David Moide from Foundry Lab. And we're going to talk, they're going to be a little bit of sciencey based startups. So we're going to explore the opportunities that science-based startups have for us.
Today's guest is brought to you by Vanta. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for global frameworks like ISO 27001 and SOC 2, saving you time and money, helping you build customer trust. Over 8,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, Sharesies and Flossy all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. I actually had dinner with the whole Vanta team, and I knew instantly that they would be the sponsor on the podcast. They just genuinely care about startups, and to make it go even one better, they've actually decided that my audience gets a special offer of $1,000 USD off from Vanta. All you have to do is go to vanta.com/startup theatre and enjoy your $1,000 USD off now.
With me, I've got David Moide from Foundry Lab. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
And also Axton Pitt from LitMaps. Who, again, two early stage companies, startups that we love. So yeah, at Startup Theatre, we're going to go a little bit sciencey today. So welcome. Axton, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit of your story, what LitMaps does, why you do what you do, and then what you hope your business will become.
Awesome. Thanks, Serge. So essentially, LitMaps is on a mission to accelerate impactful science. That's why we're here. But that really came from a very personal story. So a friend of mine had a PhD project and struggling to understand how different domains tie together. And so we thought, being, Kiwis or being of that mindset, we can build something ourselves and fix that problem. So we essentially created a tool that shows how papers cite each other over time, which is scientific papers reference each other. And basically it's letting us see from other domains, can you leverage, someone in biology who's doing work, if you're in biochemistry, for example. And this is sort of helping people understand what's been done before, sort of the prior art of the field, and help them contribute something new. So we help early career researchers. So we help around 2 million around the world now. And so this is really the master's to PhD to sort of postdoc level and helping them get up to speed in their domain, essentially.
So 2 million users of your product trying to accelerate their own research.
Yeah.
And have you got either a specific example of somebody's cross-field research that was accelerated or serendipitously, found something that they might not have otherwise that might be useful for the world?
Yeah, so there's two examples that we talk about. One is there's a sort of a consultant in the, decarbonization space, and Christopher was looking at, how battery storage and different technologies can help with his consulting work. And so he can leverage our tool to look at, all different parts of the stack and help convey policy and research to the Department of Energy, for example, in the US. So that's an example of, he hasn't told us specifics of some of that, but you can imagine he's sort of using our tools to tie different things together. Another one is a cardiothoracic surgeon in Spain. And so he's in a very different area where before the surgery, he's going in and looking at papers on our topic, on his topics, and leveraging some of that research in his surgical theatre. So that's a pretty extreme example, and that doesn't happen every day, but a really interesting example where if we can accelerate some of the tools scientists use, there's sort of, non-linear or better outcomes that can happen because of that.
Perfect. I assume you're using AI inside your product to make it work efficiently?
Yeah, so we obviously started a bit before sort of generative AI stuff. So we leverage things like how papers cite each other as a graph network. And so that's very, network science, very basic things. But we also use large language models to understand what's the paper abstract talking about and suggest papers in similar domains. So we use the breadth of metadata that's what's tried and true and what everyone would know, and also some of the newer technologies as well.
And what share of your customers right now and outside of New Zealand and Australia?
Yeah, it's about 92%. So most of our customers are overseas. We've got about 8% of our user base in New Zealand.
Awesome, that's great. What do you hope to achieve long term? If you think about how big LitMaps could be in terms of its impact on the planet, where could it logically go?
Yeah, I think there's a starting point where we're helping people understand what's already been done. So that human effort is spent better, essentially, so that you're not just redoing the same work over and over again. You're getting new people working on new things and building new technologies and developments. So that impacts things like, cancer treatments, energy, and, domains
all
that we
domains
care
of
about.
science.
Yeah, so that's really the initial phase. And then the next phase is looking at, as AI comes on stream, maybe the history of the scientific literature becomes more of a what's worked and what hasn't worked. And you can leverage that and reformat that literature in a better way. So it's not just a massive scientific paper. It's actually, here are the sort of the findings, and you can take that and run with it. So there's reformatting that, and I think that's going to impact things like companies a lot more than science itself. And
Explain that a little bit.
So companies aren't as interested in maybe blue sky exploration. They want to tie it to a product or a technology they're working on. So I think it'll help a lot with that process as well.
Awesome. What if you had to estimate what share of science is duplication or something that's been proven or disproven before?
That's really hard. I think it's accelerated a lot with countries just pumping out papers now. So China and India and countries where historically they haven't published as much. So it feels like there's just a massive increase in publication rates. So yeah, I don't know the percentages.
No, but if you had to guess, I won't hold you to
20%,
it, but we won't publish the podcast. Yeah,
yeah. Maybe it's 20% or something. I don't know. There's some amount of rework and things that people realize after the fact. Oh, actually, this is the same as what someone else has done.
Great. Okay. So, David, tell us a little bit about your story at Foundry Lab.
Okay, cool. So we're metal casting. So we're a startup based in Wellington and just moving overseas to the States. Kind of the vision is to rebuild casting in the West. So our thesis is, or if you look at metal casting across Western countries, America and Europe, there's been this massive offshoring. So specifically America, sorry, I talk too much about there, but they're down to about 30% of capacity. So most of the casting has now been taken offshore.
Do you want to just describe what casting is for
Cool.
everybody?
Metal casting. All right. Since I think the oldest casting we know is about 8,000 years old, and essentially it is you want a metal part, so you make a mold or a negative of the part. So you've got a void in the shape of what you want, and you're pouring metal in, liquid metal. So you heat the metal up, melt it, pour it into that mold, and it fills the mold and then sets, goes hard, and you end up with a physical part.
Well, it sounds like someone solved that problem 8,000 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. So
hate to break it to you.
We claim that we're the only innovation in the last 8,000 years. Is that? So that's been done for years and years and years. What's happened is, in the West anyway, we were the leading producers of casting. There's been this offshoring, and we can go into that if you want to, but there's just been this general idea that we'll offshore anything that's not smart, right? Get someone else to do this. We'll keep designing and doing the intelligent stuff, and we'll take the manufacturing offshore. And so what's happened essentially is you've got these decimated industries, and then recently, especially post-COVID, the sudden realization that without the ability to make, you're very weak. Right, so and that's kind of the whole defence plays come into that a lot, but just national sovereignty, so we've been working on this technology that really started at a point of I was trying to be able to cast myself, and what's become apparent is there's actually this need.
So it's a backyard caster kind of thing, just to make your own metal parts.
Bathtub casting.
Okay, is that what it's called?
Yeah, no, well, that's what I was doing. So, yeah, I trained as an industrial designer. And so I did about 15 years industrial design, so designing products for mass manufacture. Most of it ended up being made in China. But what started to happen was, and I was running my own consultancy, I was getting these clients coming in and asking us to design a part. So let's say that part there's cast. So they would come in, we'd design that product, and then they'd say, look, I need 10. I need 10 to go and prove the market, or I need to go get this certified by a certifying body. And then you'd say to them, well, look, there is actually no way to make you 10 because the way it works is you have to make a mold. And those molds, let's say the mold for this piece might be close to $100,000. So it's an extremely expensive thing to set up, and then relatively cheap once it's set up. But if you are wanting onesies, twosies, it's a $100,000 part. Becomes extremely expensive. So I was getting very frustrated with customers asking for it, and me saying, sorry, there's no option, and sending them off to spend their $100,000 to get their part to test to see whether we'd designed it right. So neck on the line all the time. And so in typical Kiwi way, us Kiwis, it's been, well, this is stupid. There must be a way to do this. So into the backyard and into the bathtub, messing with casting, which was dangerous in hindsight.
And so what's the role of science in all this? It just sounds like you're reinventing a 8,000-year-old process.
Yeah.
What's the role of science in this?
Yeah, probably realizing the science later on in the process, but did a lot of what we call brute forcing initially. So it's a bunch of engineers on Google searching for papers.
Should have been on LitMaps.
Should have been on LitMaps.
David,
it's a revelation just before. So kind of lucked our way, brute forced our way into a bunch of things, and then realized just how little we knew. And so then started to bring on
how little you knew about
experts. What? Metallurgy, chemistry. We're using ceramics for our molds.
So material science.
Yeah. Huge material science play. And I approached it from the angle of being an industrial designer, so it was all user experience. So I was looking at going, how do I do this without burning myself? How do I make this actually a nice experience to cast? Casting is dirty, dark, and dangerous, right? So it's there's smoke and there's fire and people do get hurt. And I was looking at going, well, if I'm going to be casting, or if I'm going to ask someone else to cast, how do I do this in a way that's safe.
Yeah, so when you talk user experience, it's not like what we normally have here on Startup Theatre,
SaaS,
which is
no.
move the button from the left to the right, make it slightly bigger and orange.
No, it's more like locking people out so they can't put their hand in something hot. And so we got into it and then realized how little we knew. So bringing on Metallurgist, I think revolutionized our company, where we were casting with our system, and from the outside they looked great. When you got into the metallurgy of it, they were awful. But having a metallurgist come in and go, hey, if we pull this lever, all of a sudden you're starting to get
Levers
good castings.
being different materials, or different materials under different conditions?
Or process, materials, everything. And just having someone who knew what they were doing in the science makes a massive difference. To be fair, our team learnt a lot. So, we've had mechanical engineers become quasi-materials engineers in the process. But
yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I do think the sort of cross-domain learning of startups, especially startups that are in this, on one hand there's the pure science of it. On the other hand, there's the application of science, and then there's the application of science across domains. And when you combine domain A, B, and C in this way, that's kind of where the magic happens, right?
Yeah, I'd like to think the fact that we knew nothing to start with probably was an advantage, in that we took on a very conservative and well-known process. As I say, 8,000 years old casting. Went into it completely wrong. Even had an email from kind of the world authority on casting to say what we were doing was wrong.
Like a red rag to a bull, I imagine,
absolutely.
to an entrepreneur.
We absolutely did everything wrong. But in the process, discovered something that no one had looked at before, and which is now, we're now seeing the strongest aluminium castings in the world. We're getting incredible results. And it's 50% because we didn't know what we're doing and we tried something and got it to work, 50% because we brought scientists in and went, okay, this basically is working now. How do we actually get it to fly?
Sounds like a repeatable formula, knowing nothing.
Absolutely.
Knowing nothing and then from time to time dragging in a scientist.
Yeah. No, I would say probably if one regret would be that we didn't bring science in soon enough.
Perfect. And so who are your customers now? And why, I guess?
So automotive, US and Japan.
Presumably they know how to make parts, so why do they choose you?
Yeah, because this is the same problem that everyone's got. You just can't do onesies, twosies in casting.
Right.
It hasn't existed.
Right. So they're doing it for new models, just build this part.
Yeah, so automotive is a mixture. It's conceptual design, trying new things, quite a lot in sort of crash testing. So it's really interesting in trying to figure out what's going to happen to a car when they crash. So it's much cheaper to print a small piece and smash that into a wall than it is to do a whole car. So we're doing a bit of that, a little bit with DoD in the US.
Department of Defense. I assume you can't talk about that.
Can't talk about that.
You have to kill me.
We're doing quite a lot with sort of industrial hardware companies. So, big electrical companies, and quite a bit now, starting with startups in the sort of transport space. Just started some aerospace stuff.
Awesome. And so what's your vision for your business? Is it a maker of metal parts in every backyard? Is it a service to third parties? What's sort of the mid to long term vision of your business?
We want to unlock casting for everybody. So the idea is that companies can take on this technology, which is very different from starting a foundry, and be outputting high quality castings. And the reason that's kind of ideological, but the reason for that is that I think we can rebuild manufacturing in the West and bring that back in, so just to re-strengthen our sovereign capabilities.
Why does that matter? Like, to be honest, like,
okay, we're going to go down the rabbit hole.
No, we can get down the rabbit hole for a little bit. But why does it matter? I need some parts for my bicycle. I go on AliExpress and get the parts for my bicycle. Does that really matter? Yeah.
Okay, so that's a really interesting starting point. I took my kids to a museum in Napier called the Faraday Centre. Great place. And my kids were looking at something, and I came across this little plaque, which was next to a bicycle spoke maker, and the plaque said that the New Zealand used to put out something like 700 bicycles. Was it a month? Like 700 a week.
Yeah.
In the 70s, 80s, and then essentially a tariff was removed, and we lost that industry overnight. And it was kind of a wake-up call, going, "Wow, we used to make a lot of bicycles. That's incredible." But moreover, we've very much steered away from DoD. wasn't interested in killing anybody. That's still not interested in
good,
killing
David.
anybody.
Welcome.
But had a very interesting discussions there where they were saying, hey, we need this technology. I was saying, look, I'm not interested in working with you. And I kind of went on a bit of a road looking at, well, where do I stand on DoD and foreign policy, especially working with the States. And got to this point where I realized I was fairly hypocritical in that I think that New Zealand operates and functions under a protective cloak or behind the shield of countries like the US. Even if you're looking into like shipping lanes and things and just going, well, actually America is keeping those running. And realizing, at the time that this was all happening, ISIS was going on, and I was like, actually, I want someone to deal with ISIS, and then realizing that we don't want to be involved in some of this stuff, still don't want to be involved in some of this stuff, but realizing that some of that is actually making the New Zealand that we love and is protecting the New Zealand that we love. So it's kind of ideological, but it's looking at it and going, actually, I think a strong West helps New Zealand to be what I think it should be.
Got it. Well, this science-based podcast got into geopolitics pretty quickly.
Yes, sorry.
So, Axton, you hear that story. So you hear the story of a ambitious entrepreneur who crosses disciplines, leverages science to build a new way of doing something that is impactful on the world. What are your reactions to that?
Yeah, I did have a quick question as well. I was curious about how it differs from like metal 3D printing and things like this. Is there a...
Yeah. Okay, so metal 3D printing has been really interesting in that there was a lot of smoke, maybe not as much fire. There was there were people who were raising $1 billion for these 3D printing companies. What I don't think most people realize is that manufacturing is one of the most conservative industries you'll ever find. And so 3D printing's come in and gone, hey, stop what you're doing and try this new technology. Accept a different outcome. And that's actually not so easy to do. So like if you're talking, sorry, I'm taking all the mic time. If you're talking, let's say, aerospace, you can't just swap a part that used to be cast for a 3D print. It actually requalifies the whole aircraft.
And so is that to do with compliance stuff or practical things?
Both. What's really interesting, if you look into the engineering of these things, a part will be designed to fail at some point. If a certain part doesn't fail at the right point, then it puts stress somewhere else, let's say on an aircraft wing, and all of a sudden you've got something else bearing stress that it shouldn't have. So it actually it's these things are designed holistically rather than I just design my one part. So 3D printing, incredible technology, does amazing stuff, was going for the same market that we were, which was, hey, we can do your onesies, twosies rather than tooling. The problem is it's a different result. And so what we're saying is actually we're going to get you a part that's identical to what you're used to. It's in the same alloy. It is a casting. But we've found a way to get there within 48 hours rather than the 6 months that it normally takes.
Cool. That's awesome.
Sorry.
No, that satisfies my curiosity. I think for me it's sort of, these sort of approaches where you get someone who's super keen and just investigates and figures things out, combined with, what is the existing approaches and try and, maybe push them forward. I think there's an element of just sweat and getting in there and doing things, but also being, somewhat guided by, here's the techniques at current state of the art and pushing them. So for me, that's where science comes in. It's sort of it's helping to create these sort of deep tech companies or companies leveraging technology, but also gives you some sort of differentiator where you can, maybe compete against other companies around the world that are doing something similar to you because you've come up with something novel that, might not have been in a academic institution where you've, done that, but it's sort of leveraging the same ideas.
Have you got a couple of domains or areas where you think real breakthroughs are going to happen and that will actually change our planet?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of bullish on some of the nuclear fusion stuff. I think there's some, new materials and new approaches that are helping to push that along. And obviously there's things like OpenStar in New Zealand that are, attempts at that based on superconductivity that, is a great approach, I think.
So what could OpenStar achieve if it actually gets to its mission? Maybe we'll get them on at some point.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially a way of a new energy production source that is, can produce a lot of energy as a base load for the grid, whereas, maybe solar and wind isn't that. Obviously, we're lucky to have hydro in New Zealand as well, but yeah, lots of countries around the world don't have that kind of energy mix. So that seems super good. Obviously, there's the AI, things that have happened, whether that's actually GPUs and chips getting down and helping that, as well as the sort of the the design of training and models there. So those are the obvious two things. I think there's a bunch of, maybe bioengineering and human augmentation stuff that could happen that is interesting. I've always been interested in things like the singularity, where you sort of merge with machines and things like this, but a little bit of science fiction. So I don't know, there's areas there that I'm interested in. Obviously we're very focused on what we're doing, so it's sometimes hard to look around. But yeah, in the end, I think theoretical physics as well is the thing where if we can push beyond, current understanding of physics and get a unified model, then we could do some interesting things.
And since we descended into geopolitics pretty quickly, how would you describe the state of science education, science literacy, starting with New Zealand, but then Australia, the West, versus the rest of the world?
Yeah, there's a lot of
and you must have really good
there.
data about that, given, again, you see every research paper being spat out and whether or not it gets cited and whether or not it's relevant.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing, I guess a lot of this comes down to how much funding and effort you put into these areas, because a lot of it's correlated to, how many spots there are, or how many teachers, or how many institutions there are doing things. So, yeah, we obviously see a lot of papers, but we don't focus on, trends of countries and publishing. But you definitely see, countries like China producing a lot more papers, and that's been the story of the last 10 years, is that them exceeding the US sort of output of scientific papers, basically. And, does that sort of challenge some of the Western hegemony of leading science and having investment there? But yeah, I think for us, I think we're doing okay. I don't think we're, at the bottom of the world in terms of scientific performance, and we produce a lot of people that go on to, do great work and are leading around the world. So there's a mix there, and I do think we punch above our weight, but we also want to invest in and continue that. So that's sort of my New Zealand view. I think overseas, I think it's going to become this sort of alliance of networks. You're not going to have a globalized sort of science anymore. You're going to have, some countries working together and creating consortiums, and others that are the opposite and creating their own. So for us, I think it's how do we tie into those, whether it's with Europe or whether it's with the US, and continuing those relationships. And we're probably going to have to become a little bit self-sufficient in those areas, so we can't totally rely on some partners that were other countries that we can't work with maybe, or have challenging relationships with. So that's sort of a future world where it's more federated than sort of globalized.
Does it affect your business at all?
I think if we can sort of be agnostic and as a tool, then I don't think so. But obviously there might be cases where there's, sanctions or things where you can't engage with countries that will practically affect us.
Are there any papers or discoveries that are secret in a way that LitMaps can't see them or access them, and does it affect anything in what you do?
Yeah, a lot of this, I guess, comes down to whether it's published. So if it's published, usually it's not secret, right? You wouldn't put out things. But obviously in that, you also might redact things or have things not in the paper that might be your secret source, or the way you achieved what you're trying to do. So a lot of this is maybe example is in AI papers where they say, hey, we've got this great result, but they don't really tell you the recipes and how they train things and some of the details. So you either have to be an expert to be able to reverse engineer, understand that, or you just don't have access to it. So yeah, a lot of stuff is highly curated and where it's published and what it's published, whether it's in maybe nuclear energy research or something like this. It would be, if the DOE funding it in the US, then they would think about, what's going to be published.
All right, so changing gears altogether, want to talk a little bit about the founder journeys. So David, perhaps start with you a little bit about perhaps what's been most surprising about your personal founder journey, and whether there's been any anecdotes that highlight that surprise or the unexpected in your own founder journey. Obviously, as you're saying, you're an industrial designer. You set about solving a particular problem in a bathtub, and you've ended up in building essentially portable foundries and foundering as a service, if foundering is a word. But at a personal level, what's been different to what you might have expected as a founder?
Yeah, I think every founder has a certain amount of imposter syndrome, right?
Sure.
I think we all sit there going, aren't we supposed to really know more about what we're doing and be more onto it? I think what's surprised me is how much I've loved the sort of CEO type role, because I think that often happens, founder CEO. A lot of it just felt like it fell in my lap. I think maybe not so purposeful, just kind of it happened. I think even the founding story, I mean, I was trying to fix this problem of casting specifically for my clients in my firm. and I had an investor ring up and say that they were looking at what industrial design firms were working on, because it tended to be at the forefront of tech, and can they come have a look? So this was Laura from W&T Ventures. So she came down and had a look at what we were doing, my customer work, and went, none of this is interesting. And just kind of went, I've got an hour before my flight. What else are you doing? So I was like, wow, I'm messing around
Check
with
out my
this thing in my
bath.
bathtub. But you can't invest in it because it's not a thing. Right. So I think that was really interesting, was how, specifically with VC, but how soon they would come in, how early they would come in. It was really an idea in the bathtub. And then I think probably everyone underestimates how much work's involved in getting these things up and running. And I think you get too deep before you know what you're getting into, and then you figure out how much this is going to tax you. But at the same time, super huge highs. When we started hitting these properties where we're better than a conventional casting, there's a massive, and that was years into it.
When you say properties, you mean stronger, strength-based?
Yeah, strength-based. Yeah, so you're starting to see that you're actually changing. Hopefully there'll be a paper at some point, but you're actually changing the body of work in the world, and that's super exciting. Just trying to think of any anecdotes. You might have to come back to me on that one.
Perfect. Okay, we will. While you're thinking, though, so how do you think about the balance between getting kicked in the balls, as you were describing it earlier, on a weekly or daily basis, and then the occasional high where you get a breakthrough?
Look, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. I think you spend most of the day getting kicked. Yeah, I think if you're working on something that you believe in, then the highs are probably enough to kind of keep carrying you through.
And do you think that's unique to you or people like you, or is it almost human universal?
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a certain amount of crazy people in this world that actually think they can make a difference. I'd like to think that I'm mostly naive and just jump headlong into things, and sometimes they work out. I think my wife will tell you that I'm lucky a lot. Yeah. I don't know. I think for me there was a problem that I thought I could solve, and as I say.
Well, you didn't think you could solve it.
Yeah, well, I was naive enough to give it a go.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, we have that naivety as a theme quite often. I mean, I don't like that word personally, because it's somewhat insulting in the wrong way. Crazy is much better, or unaware, or some other thing, Anyhow, and maybe while you think of, I guess, the illustrative story of your personal founder journey, maybe, Axton, do you want to talk a bit about yours and what surprised you about becoming founder CEO? I don't think you were always CEO at LitMaps. And just tell us a little bit about your journey.
So obviously, for me, I started out as CTO, so more on the technology and getting things done. So I guess my arc is transitioning to the CEO and being more public facing, as well as, trying to get sort of ownership in some of those areas. So it's, been really rewarding to do that. You have to put yourself outside your comfort zone, whether that's pitching or whether that's sort of team related things and showing leadership. So that for me has been a really interesting character development over the last few years. And so coaching has helped a lot. So,
you built a coach?
But from one of our investors, but that has, helped me sort of work through that and get better. But that, I think, has been really rewarding as well. It's, impacts lots of parts of your life, but also, you're not just comfortable in your little spot, you're stretching yourself beyond that. And so that for me is, maybe it's some of the self-awareness stuff, but it lets you sort of reflect and build and improve. So that's been an interesting part of it. I think the other part as well is just, it's been a long, dream of mine to do a startup and be a founder and work on things like this. And so being able to do that is very satisfying. And whether that's, seeing my dad run his own business or being involved in, we have a CNC milling machine at home at my parents' place. And so being able to program that and mill things, make molds and things, has sort of been interesting to see that. And so you get the sort of understanding you could do this, like you could make things happen from scratch, and sort of, you also see the struggle of like, not everything works out and you have to push through and make things happen. So my personal experience is seeing, translating that into actual reality and try and do it for myself and see where that goes, and somewhat have an optimistic take, whereas you could do this and, what's the worst that can happen, and sort of that you're only, alive once, and some of those concepts.
Well, David's
they're just light bulb moment. But I think you're exactly right on that. What's the worst that could happen? I remember, so I did a degree in industrial design, and there's kind of, I mean, people talk about this, but maybe the rat race, but all this, you kind of have lane, right? I've studied this thing, it's quite specific. I need to now excel in this thing. And I can remember the day that I decided to move off and do this other startup thing, absolutely freaking out on, I'm now leaving the lane. Am I going to ever be able to get back in the lane? And I remember a really good conversation with my dad where I was saying, I'm thinking about doing this thing, but, I've got maybe 2 months of money. Like if this doesn't work out, what's going to happen? And I remember Dad saying, do you know anyone that's starved to death? And I was like, no, I don't know anyone that's starved to death. And he's like, it's going to be fine. But I think that is one of the things I think that has become really apparent to me is you can get tied into things where it stifles your ability. And I'm absolutely not against having a degree. I think it's fantastic trying to get my kids to do the same thing. But there is a potential to stifle your creativity or your ability to move through lanes because you are very much stuck to I have to do this thing. And I think that in a lot of ways was holding me back. And what's really interesting is you step out and the floor disappears from underneath you, and then you kind of recover and realize actually you can swim, or you can.
Yeah, it's a perfect analogy. I think about it, and I had the same realization in my early 20s. I thought I'm moving out of my lane, for which I have a degree and
I spent a lot of money on it.
And then think, shit, if I moved lanes to something quite different, and which I knew nothing about, which happens to be tech in this case, or software, will I ever be able to move back into my lane? And it's kind of, not only will I be able to move back into the lane in reality, but I can move into any lane, as you have obviously done. I think that's a great metaphor. And for some reason, we think life is filled with lanes, and they're just weird cognitive constructs that don't really exist.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Great. Leadership. So you talked about, to what extent do you think you're a natural born leader, which I know you're humble, so you won't sort of accept that label. To what extent is your leadership natural, genetic, sort of historical versus learned and evolved over, say, since you've taken over as CEO of LitMaps? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it for me is probably learned, but also sort of showing by example is a big thing. So yeah, trying to, exhibit the behavior you want to see and do that. So I think of that as leadership. And yeah, that's a big part of what I do, is trying to, demonstrate what I think is the way it should be done and the values as well and those sorts of concepts. And, that I think is taken as leadership. And that's, a big part of it for me is, seeing what other leaders have done and saying, oh, I like that part of this and I want to take that and make it my own. So not trying to imitate people and, just be like, oh, I saw Steve Jobs, I want to, wear a black turtleneck and do everything there. But it's being like, oh, actually, I want to be authentic to myself and just be who I am and be the best person I can be. So that's really what ties into leadership for me.
So for you, in that context, just to paraphrase, leadership is personal, as in you're the Axton version of a leader, not the Julius Caesar / Gandhi / Martin Luther King / Steve Jobs version.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Great. What would the leadership advice to the 16-year-old version of yourself be, given what you know now, other than what I've just said?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of advice around, do what you love and this sort of thing, and I think that's really bad advice. So I think my point of view is more that comes from people who have, really worked hard at a skill or an industry and mastered and become successful, and then they love that job or that role. So I think it's more find something you can put up with that you're good at, that not many other people want to do. And over time, you will then love that thing and be, have a really satisfying life in that. So I think it's like do hard things, try and build relationships with people and make sure you're present and are doing that. So it's a lot more about, I guess putting yourself out there and not being too worried about what other people think and this sort of thing. So that advice would have been really good for me when I was that
What's
age.
The difference for you between doing an easy thing that you're already good at versus doing a hard thing that you may be good at?
That's a good question. I think there's things where you have like an innate skill, like maybe it's the analogy is like an athlete, you're really good at running, or maybe you have a natural ability at some point. But there is a trade-off where if you are naturally good at it, then you might not try as hard to push through and get even better at that thing. So there's almost like a trade-off of finding something you're good at, but then be able to push and train and go beyond that. So I guess it's the hard things is within that thing maybe comes easy to you, there will be moments and hard things that'll come up, and so you want to lean into that and yeah, get help and do all those things to overcome it.
Excellent. David, for you, thinking about leadership, to what extent do you think of yourself as a leader versus a founder versus an inventor versus a designer versus someone who can sell casting stuff to an automotive company?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, too humble. I think if I look back at my life, there's always been leadership roles. I think there's nothing like figuring out that you're not a great leader than doing a startup, and especially when it's a small bunch of you and it's intense.
Why do you say that specifically in a startup?
I think in a startup, compared to my work that I was doing in sort of commercial industry, startup is 4 or 5 people in a room, sometimes late at night. Your decisions very much affect everyone instantly, and there's a lot of risk taking, and so I think you as a leader end up often taking a risk that doesn't make sense to everyone else, and having to back yourself on it. And I don't know about companies you've worked, but definitely get told, like this is maybe a dumb idea. And so there's been a lot of that. No way. There's been a lot of that where you just sometimes learning to follow your gut. And maybe in this whole process, a lot of learning that sometimes or often the gut is right. And so not doing what Steve Jobs did and not doing the turtleneck. That has been an interesting part of the journey. I think that's that and risk taking, being prepared to take a risk. I think if we go back to the question you had for Axton, what would I tell 16-year-old me? It would be take way more risks. I think I'd set myself up for a very predictable life before I started.
Yeah, it's funny because I think about whenever I see some corporate leader write a book on leadership, I kind of go...
boring.
Well, there's boring generally, but also leadership when the risk is minimal, let's say we ran Coca-Cola, we've got to decide, what margins are we expecting from our Australian subsidiary?
Yeah.
Well, there's a functional decision someone has to make, and you've got to manage lots of people making those decisions. But where's the existential risk thing?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In that, because and I sort of so not only is it boring, but I sort of don't think of it as leadership in the way you articulate, because the risk profile isn't there. The existential consequence of everyone losing their jobs immediately or in the next 2 months or whatever, soon, isn't there. So I think that's kind of what you're referring to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's mostly directional, and it is mostly in crisis mode, and so you're going, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to steer us in this direction. There can be some healthy argument and healthy debate, but essentially in the end, if you're the leader, you're making the call, and you're going, you know what? We're going to go down this path, and there's a good chance that you're going to miss product market fit, or you're going to lose staff members because they don't believe in the direction that you're going, or so those things are super scary. But I guess this is part of that, just kind of in leadership, backing yourself and going, actually, this is if this is my company, and if this is what I think the technology needs to do, then we'll go down this track.
Awesome. Hey, we normally towards the tail end of the conversations get into rapid fire questions. So I've just got a couple. I'll do one at a time, so you don't answer, or maybe answer the same question.
Can I throw one in too?
Yeah, go.
Can we get LitMaps for patents?
Yes.
LitMaps for patents.
LitMaps for
That's a good
patents.
idea.
Yeah, because our Google searching all the time is going through papers to see what other people have done to try and leverage what we can, and going through patents to see what
Make
people
sure
have done.
you can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion.
There you are. There's your next business line. 5% for David.
There we go.
I'll take 2.
Yeah.
Great question. All right. So rapid fire. What are you most worried about in your business today?
Yeah, we recently acquired a company, and so integrating that well and doing the launch of that well, that's the biggest worry and concern right now. So
perfect. What excites you, David, the most about what you're working on at the moment?
I think we're just commercializing now, so it's that customer. That customer stuff's amazing.
And David, if you could hire on only one attribute your next hire, what would be the single attribute you'd look for, and why?
Creativity, always.
Creativity, and why? Kind of self-explanatory, but there's a trade-off.
I think when you're doing something that's pushing the boundaries, if you hire someone who wants to just do the status quo, it's not going to, I hire for people who can dig themselves out of a hole.
Great quote. What's the role of creativity in science, since we're on that, Axton? How do you think about that?
I think it's a massive part of it, because you have to have a different mental model or way of thinking compared to other people to attack a problem differently. For example, Geoffrey Hinton, he wanted to understand how the brain worked, and so that led him to push and challenge and keep going down the neural network pathway when everyone else didn't believe in it. And then eventually compute caught up, and now we have things like large language models that came from that.
Awesome. If you were a dictator of our educational system, let's just use New Zealand, but I think as a proxy Australia and maybe the UK and other markets, what would you implement immediately?
I don't have a specific policy. I'd say we have to get back to maybe the grind or the struggle of it. So I think education is struggle. And so you have to struggle with concepts, struggle with, learning and any sort of things that help you avoid that is a problem. So whether that's, just letting people have to think through themselves and struggle with problems. I think that's
how do we reframe that grind? Because obviously you talk about it as kicking the balls. It comes in different flavors for different people.
Yeah.
The idea that grind isn't necessary and valuable in its own right, it's kind of a weird cultural disappearance. I don't know how either of you comment on that.
Maybe it's sharpening the sword or the irons and fire kind of thing, where you're just training and you're improving. I don't know. That's probably the way I'd frame it.
But we need language, right? Like I get parents who coach football, like, oh, my son's tired today. I'm like, that's great. That's part of the job is to play football when you're tired.
If you had asked me the question, I would have said go back to when I was at school. Probably all through generations. I think this idea of self-led is crazy. I think you need to have people, your teachers need to be inspiring you and pushing you into new thought and new ideas. I think going, hey, I like this idea and I'm going to go for that, never pushes you to do something you don't like. And I think the reality is most of your life you're doing stuff that a portion of it is stuff that you don't like.
So who's pushing you?
It's a mixture of investors and customers, I suppose. And my engineers.
Perfect. So getting pushed, everyone.
Yeah. As leadership, you're just getting pushed, right?
All right. Hey, well, that's the end of the sort of conversation. We normally have a section called Spotlight, where we highlight a few other startups. Obviously, because we're doing the science edition today, or hopefully one of several science editions over the next coming months. Perhaps each of you could highlight a startup in the science-centric domain that you think is doing interesting stuff and describe what they do, and maybe give the URL for the audience so they can go and find more. So maybe start with you, David.
Cool. Hotline Labs, have to big ups to the Wellington crew. So they are using, if I get this right, they're using like waste wood or biomass and capturing CO2 with it, and then releasing it on demand into greenhouses or into agriculture. So creating little gardens of Eden, more produce because they control the CO2.
Excellent.
So Tice Robinson, I think, CEO.
Okay, and it's hotlinelabs.com.
I believe so, yeah.
And you, Axton?
Yeah, I was trying to think about this. I think I did mention them in my conversation earlier. I think OpenStar, are the ones to mention. I think a lot of people probably know about them, but just the fact that they're having a go at nuclear fusion in New Zealand is pretty audacious and worth shouting out. So basically they're having a different approach to nuclear reactors that, have historically not worked and taken a long time. So it's basically a concept where you use superconducting to generate magnetism that lets you control the plasma in a better way, that's much more self sort of organizing, and then hopefully the fusion is easy, but it's hard to make the magnets. I think that's the pitch.
Excellent. So Axton, you have one more opportunity to give a spotlight to a science-based startup in this part of the world. Who would you give it to?
Yeah, I want to shout out LabMates. So they're creating a community for scientists to help them, and maybe early in the career, have ways of upskilling or networking with each other and furthering their careers. So that seems like a great initiative.
Perfect. And how would you find LabMates?
I think it's LabMates. If you just Google them, I think they'll come up. I don't know the exact.
And the founder is
Maddie White, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for joining us in the studio today for a conversation around science-based startups at Startup Theatre. Really grateful for your insights and I guess learning a little bit about your personal journeys too. So thanks again. Best of luck with the rest of the year.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Serge.
Thanks, Serge, yeah.
Hey, well, that was a great conversation. I'm very glad I had Axton and David on the show. I think we had, I thought it was a great conversation. I thought it illuminated the possibility of science and our startups and how far they can go. One thing I feel we didn't really explore as well as I would have liked is really to uncover how many opportunities science delivers to us, right? There are 2 million users in LitMaps, many of whom are making discoveries, science-based discoveries. Many or most of those discoveries can themselves be the source of inspiration for a science-based startup, as it was with Foundry Lab. And I think many in the community, including our universities, schools, policymakers, and even startup founders themselves, don't really understand the scope of possibility for each of these scientific discoveries to give birth to the next world-changing idea, which then becomes the next world-changing company, which in its own right will inspire the next world-changing company. And so I feel like perhaps I didn't do a good job of that, but I am really, really excited by the possibilities science has for our startups today and in the future. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.